What's up, Yoon-Fam? It is I,
Mark Yoon.
Hey, Yoon-Fam. This is Aaron, also known as DeathSoul777. Mark just calls me Death. I'm here to talk about Siegfried and Nightmare, the specific distinction between them, and their importance to the lore and story of Soul Calibur, the series. So let's get into it and have some fun. Alright. So, Mark already has 2 great videos about Siegfried and Nightmare, and it goes over their broad lore and how they interact in the story and with each other, and it does talk about their distinction as well. This video is more about the discussion, the nitty gritty, and maybe some rampant speculation, which I love. So let's get into it. So everybody knows Siegfried's general story about how he's a kid from Germany. His dad left. His dad being what's his dad's name? Oh yeah. So everybody knows Siegfried's story. Generally speaking, his father Frederick that he killed, and how that tore up his mind and made him become Nightmare, and then eventually becoming free from Nightmare, and then them doing battle and all that good stuff. But to get into some specific character and lore talk, I wanted to talk about Siegfried's mental state after killing his father, and how that mental state really sorry, I'll say that again. And how that mental state really interacts with Soul Edge in particular, because it appears to be the case that Soul Edge does have a thing for madness and negative emotions and chaos. So when Siegfried eventually does defeat Inferno Cervantes and take up the sword, his character and the character of Nightmare seem to be completely one and the same, as him and Soul Edge are symbiotic with each other. If you notice the other wielders of Soul Edge, their bodies don't change like Siegfried's does. Cervantes is still very much a guy. Algol is still very, very much who he is when he's wielding Soul Edge. But when Siegfried wields Soul Edge, he becomes Nightmare, meaning that he is the exact same thing as what Nightmare is. And the distinction is only between the sword and Nightmare, because Nightmare talks to his sword. He asks it to give him strength. He asks if it wants more souls, and so forth. A little sippy sippy for the boys here, bro. That's delicious. So getting into Soul Calibur, understanding this distinction is kind of key as we move through the story. Once Nightmare is defeated by Kilik and Xianghua, and he becomes separated from Soul Edge, you notice that Siegfried is not. Let me say that again. Once Nightmare is defeated by Kilik and Xianghua, Siegfried is a very somber character. If you notice in his Nightmare's ending, rather, that Siegfried's father is the one speaking to him, talking about his sins and how he has to repent. And it appears obviously to be going on in his mind, in his subconscious. Also, if you notice that Siegfried, as he stabs his father in Nightmare's ending, it seems to be Xianghua's weapon. Perhaps this is symbolic of Soul Calibur separating Siegfried's mind from Nightmare, or rather Inferno. And once Siegfried is free, he's very stoic. He's very somber. He wonders if he can really repent from his sins. But if you notice that he's fully aware of what he did as Nightmare. He he was almost like he went along with it, like he chose to do these things. If you look at his dialogue between him and Sophia, he says there's no turning back. He's not running from the things that he's doing. He's in agreement with Soul Edge to kill people, to take their souls and use them to to resurrect his father. Ugh. This is obviously a ruse from Soul Edge, but Siegfried's none the wiser, and he does it anyways. But after all that, and after Siegfried becomes separated from Nightmare, it does take 4 years before he becomes Nightmare again. And during those times, as he sleeps, the sword takes control over him. He kills people at night, and those time frames get longer and longer until eventually he does become Nightmare again. And in that time, his mental state goes from being stoic and strong to getting weaker and weaker and weaker, speaking to the idea that, again, Soul Edge requires a host that is in complete madness, not in his mind, not in his right state. And when he does again become Nightmare, there are some design tweaks that are very curious and probably speaks to the idea that Siegfried as Nightmare in Soul Calibur 2 is much more controlled by the sword than Siegfried as Nightmare in Soul Calibur 1. If you notice his body, the way his design is, he literally actually has a tail protruding from his spine, and his shoulders, instead of having an armor piece, are spiked over, and the flesh of the Soul Edge arm is creeping onto the armor that he's wearing, almost like the sword is taking more control over of what Siegfried is than what he was in Soul Calibur. Soul Calibur 1, and when we get to the new timeline, this will be discussed as well. Anyways, if you finish the arcade mode as Nightmare, what he says to Soul Edge, rather Inferno, is very curious. He basically says, "I've been waiting for this day for too long," and it would appear to be that is Siegfried actually talking and not Nightmare talking. It's kind of hard to understand why this is so, mainly because the Malfested voice didn't exist in that game. It does exist in Soul Calibur 1, between Siegfried and Nightmare, and that distortion and all that. They do bring it back in the later games. Excuse me, had to breathe there. A little more sippy for the boys. Delicious. Where was I at? Oh yeah. If you notice that the voice for Siegfried and Nightmare are the same in Soul Calibur 1, I cannot remember the voice actor's name at the moment, but they are indeed the same. In Soul Calibur 2, when it is Siegfried saying, "I've been waiting for this stage for too long," he's specifically saying it to Inferno. And this distinction is clear because obviously Inferno and the body of Nightmare are two different entities. And if this is a moment where Siegfried's actually fighting back from Inferno, it is mentioned in that Siegfried did get a split second to regain control over Nightmare, and then interesting enough, Raphael Sorel did land a blow on Soul Edge's eye in order for Siegfried to really be able to fight back and take his personhood back from Soul Edge. Speaking more to Soul Edge and Inferno, if you notice in the design of Inferno, Soul Calibur is embedded in the head of Inferno, almost like Inferno has a control over, or at least is in possession of Soul Calibur. Ooh boy! And what that basically means is that once Siegfried defeated Inferno in his mind, it released Soul Calibur. And if you notice in the beginning of Soul Calibur 3, he does use Soul Calibur to stab Soul Edge and basically nullify them both. And from there on, it's an easy distinction between Nightmare and Siegfried. Inferno takes the host of the armor of Nightmare, and if you look at the design again, it is again much more furious in its let me say it again. And if you look at the design, you can tell again it's much more monster-like. It's the arm is more disgusting, in my opinion, at least. And the way Nightmare acts is much more beastly. Instead of Siegfried's version of Nightmare, which has a sense of purpose to it. Anyways, so again, you can tell that the distinction is easy to tell. What is not so easy to tell, at least for people who haven't played the games from 1 to 2 to 3, is just how different Nightmare and Siegfried play. How their approach to combat is just a different philosophy. In Soul Calibur 1, Siegfried and Nightmare had virtually the exact same moveset, except for 2 moves. And in Soul Calibur 2, Nightmare's repertoire does actually become more in your face. He has more moves from stances than he did as when he was Nightmare in Soul Calibur 1. He does use his arm more as an attack, given that he understands what his body type is. And these things go to show that gradually the sword was indeed taking more possession over Siegfried in the way he fights. But curiously enough, there is moves that Soul Edge still keeps that are Siegfried moves, but very much Siegfried moves. But it's not necessarily the move that's important, it's the philosophy of fighting that's important. Siegfried as a character fights much more defensively. He makes good reads and has a strong defense, and then counteracts his opponent and then defeats them that way. Nightmare is much more of a rush down strength character. I don't mean rush down as in he wants to get in close. I mean from his distance he wants to beat the crap out of you, basically. And this is obviously Inferno's style of fighting that he prefers, rather than Siegfried's style of fighting that he prefers, given their obvious distinction during those times. If you move on to Soul Calibur 4, you can see that Nightmare has even more so become a different character than Siegfried. He started using powers like Soul Wave to charge his moves. Soul Wave being that move that he does in the beginning of Soul Calibur 3 to make that explosion that Zasamel, who gets ashy. Oh my god, I just called Black Man ashy. That's terrible. Soul Wave being the move that Nightmare uses in the beginning of Soul Calibur 3 to make that explosion. You start seeing it more used in his moveset. So going from there, you can tell that obviously these characters are different. They have different fighting style philosophies, even using the same type of moves that they have. But one thing I want to get to with the discussion between Siegfried and Nightmare is that it's curious to why Soul Edge still wanted to use Siegfried's moves even after Siegfried was separated from him. If you even go into Soul Calibur 5, the new host still uses those moves. It still takes a form of a Zweihander, or a greatsword, or however you want to say it, and it uses virtually almost the same moves with only a couple different moves that are obviously added. And this kind of speaks to their relationship with each other. It's been said, and and at least in the lore of the series, that Siegfried was Nightmare's favorite host. And I want to loop back to the fact that that's because of his mental state at the time, of his madness, and how, because he was so crazed at the time and delusional, it allowed him and it allowed Siegfried and Soul Edge to be much more symbiotic in nature. And again, I'm making that point again because it's a very key distinction between Siegfried and Nightmare and the old timeline versus Siegfried and Nightmare and the new timeline, which we'll be getting to now. In the new timeline, it seems to be the case that Soul Blade happens almost exactly how it happened. Hope you can add this together. In the previous timeline, you can even tell that, Siegfried doesn't have a sword anymore because it seems to be broken. When he goes to pick up Soul Edge, there's fire around the arena, hinting that he still defeated Inferno Cervantes and all that. But once he picks up Soul Edge, the Evil Seed happens. Now, the Evil Seed is an event that happened in the previous timeline. If you look at the bonus art in Soul Calibur 1's side mode, where you unlock all the museum art, you do see the Evil Seed happen in a little, almost a mini comic book or manga, if you want to say it that way. It'll be much more symbiotic in nature. And again, I'm making that point again because it's a very key distinction between Siegfried and Nightmare and the old timeline versus Siegfried and Nightmare and the new timeline, which we'll be getting to now. In the new timeline, it seems to be the case that Soul Blade happens almost exactly how it happened. Hope you can add this together. In the previous timeline, you can even tell that, Siegfried doesn't have a sword anymore because it seems to be broken. When he goes to pick up Soul Edge, there's fire around the arena, hinting that he still defeated Inferno Cervantes and all that. But once he picks up Soul Edge, the Evil Seed happens. Now, the Evil Seed is an event that happened in the previous timeline. If you look at the bonus art in Soul Calibur 1's side mode, where you unlock all the museum art, you do see the Evil Seed happen in a little, almost a mini comic book or manga, if you want to say it that way, that happens in the previous timeline. It's not given very much distinction because it does not create Malfested. In this new timeline, when Siegfried picks up Soul Edge and uses it to make the Evil Seed, it does indeed create Malfested. And this is a key distinction between the old and new timeline. Events do transpire as the same, between virtually the same. He gets Ivy and Astaroth and Aeon to be basically his subordinates and all that kind of stuff. But a big difference is when he's defeated by Kilik and Xianghua, and how he acts after that fight. You remember that I said in the previous timeline, Siegfried was very stoic after that fight, very kind of unsure of himself, but still very much a person that can function in some way. In the new timeline, Siegfried is virtually broken as a man. He's sobbing. He doesn't know what to do. He fights only just to survive, and all this other stuff. Now, the reason this is interesting is because the relationship between him and Nightmare, when they were together as one, seems to be much more of a puppet on a string. And Nightmare even says this in his battle with Siegfried in Astral Chaos. the reason this is interesting is because it appears that Soul Edge is much more in control of Siegfried around that time. He uses the image of his father to help him kill more people and get more souls for Soul Edge. And the reason this is interesting is because, again, in the previous time, it appeared that Siegfried was very well aware of what he was doing. And he knew exactly what he was doing. And he did it anyways. But, and again, new timeline, more puppet on a string. And once Siegfried eventually meets with Sophidia, which is something different that doesn't happen in the old timeline, she cleanses him a bit and he gets more clarity and becomes more Siegfried in Soul Calibur 1 versus Soul Calibur 6. And this helps him to say, okay, now I have a mission. I need to destroy Soul Edge some way, somehow. Which then he has an idea of what he wants to do. Eventually, what happens is Soul Calibur calls out to Siegfried. And this is very interesting because it doesn't happen in the old timeline. Soul Calibur does not call out to Siegfried in the old timeline. Soul Calibur appears in front of Siegfried after he's defeated Inferno in his mind to help him defeat Soul Edge. Or after it's separated from Soul Edge. It's a better way of saying it. But here, Soul Calibur is legitimately asking Siegfried for help. So, once Siegfried does enter in Astral Chaos to fend off Nightmare and / Inferno, he does stay in Astral Chaos at least for a little bit, and eventually he does come out because again, between day and night, like in the last timeline, he becomes Nightmare and more and more and more. What I want to say before I go forward, though, speaking to more of how Siegfried was controlled by Nightmare / Soul Edge, and how they're a bit more distinctive from each other, is in their design in Soul Calibur 6. If you look at Nightmare's design in Soul Calibur 6, and sorry, let me say that again, and get a little sippy for the boys. Why do I keep saying that? I don't know. If you look at Nightmare and Siegfried's design in Soul Calibur 6, their lower half, as far as their body armor is concerned, is virtually the same. There's only slight differences in the design as far as the armor structure. Also, if you look at the right side of his armor, you can see blue hueing along his arm and a bit of his thigh, alluding to the hold that Nightmare still has over him in this version of the game, in version of the story. Again, also, if you remove all of Siegfried's armor and his upper half, his arm is just discolored and disfigured. It's like, bro, what have you been doing at night? I shouldn't say that. But what also is the case is that Siegfried has this mechanic called Dark Legacy, which obviously its name is almost self-evident. The more he uses the power of Soul Edge to fight, the more Soul Edge is taking more and more of him, which is speaking to how Siegfried becomes Nightmare. It's actually a game mechanic that gives lore implication. So as Siegfried fights, the lower his health gets, the more Dark Legacy is closer to being inactive. Once you get him down to 30% health, Dark Legacy kicks in without even asking for it. However, if you rely on moves that are similar to Nightmare, you will get stacks of Dark Legacy to be used whenever you want. It's interesting how that happens. Also within his critical edge, he uses his base power to launch an opponent, but on their way down, you could see energy from his right arm going into his sword to unleash an attack that is basically an energy wave. And if you defeat an opponent with that attack, he does legitimately say, "I wish I did not rely on this strength," meaning that this is not his strength. This is the strength of his dark legacy, Soul Edge / Nightmare. So again, this is alluding to how Siegfried more and more becomes Nightmare throughout the time between this events of Soul Calibur 6 to perhaps the events of Soul Calibur 7. Whew. I don't know why I'm out of breath. It's a lot of talking. The last thing I would like to talk about is while Siegfried is being controlled by Nightmare, he's in Astral Chaos, and he's still defending Soul Calibur. And it seems to be that Soul Edge has obviously new underlings or versions of itself or amalgamations of souls that are doing his bidding. Now, Mark already has a great video on these characters and their story and their origins and all that kind of stuff. So I suggest you guys look at that if you are interested in learning more about them. But I want to speak specifically about Iska. Specifically Iska Oct versus Iska. Please edit this together. Iska, how do they say his name? Farka. Yeah, Iska Farka. And that it's described as its soul version is a boy, but its body version is a female, which is very interesting. Because this brings into question Soul Calibur Legends. And it also brings into question how canon Soul Calibur Legend is to the story. Because it's, at least to me, it's not very clear. It does seem to be the case that Siegfried in this timeline is not aware of those events. He kind of disregards it when it's talked about. Obviously, in those events, he meets up with Taki, Mitsurugi, and Sophidia. But obviously in this timeline, they don't seem to know each other. So what's going on there? There's a couple options. One, it's just Soul Edge's... Sorry, let me say that again. So what could be going on there? So we have a couple different options. One is it's just Soul Edge messing with Siegfried, giving the fans a little nod to Soul Calibur Legends. Totally fine. But it could also mean something that I've been speculating for a while that I haven't really discussed with anyone. And that is that it appears that Soul Edge and Soul Calibur are aware of the different timelines, which would make sense considering how powerful they are and how astral fissures seem to go in between timelines and different eras. So I said earlier that it seemed like Siegfried was being pulled more on a puppet on a string in this timeline versus the old timeline, and how Siegfried seems to be Soul Edge's favorite host. And it appears that Soul Edge still wants Siegfried as his host because it appears that Nightmare seems to be, at least in my opinion, stronger than other hosts of Soul Edge. My reasoning for that is Cervantes loses half of Soul Edge's power, or at least a portion of Soul Edge's power, when Sophidia breaks apart the sword. Those missing pieces allow Taki to kill Cervantes. But when Inferno takes over the body of Cervantes to stop Siegfried from picking up the sword, Siegfried still defeats Inferno. And once he picks up Soul Edge, I believe it's described as he's stronger with just the one sword than Cervantes was with both the swords, meaning that their symbiotic nature when Siegfried is in his madness strengthens Soul Edge's power because it derives from negative emotions. You could hear Nightmare constantly saying, "Show me your madness," to other characters when he fights them. He particularly says it to villainous characters. He says it to Raphael and the such. Not to say Raphael is a complete villain, but he's portrayed more as a villain throughout the series. Lastly, so speaking of that, it seems that Soul Edge wants to keep Siegfried under his palm, under his control as long as possible, because maybe he understood it lost once it lost Siegfried completely. Because it wouldn't make sense to keep up someone who lost to Kilik and Xianghua unless you know that given the full reconstruction of Soul Edge and the full symbiosis with your host, you could probably be as strong as you ever were. That's my only reasoning. Again, this is all rapid speculation. Mark can feel free to disagree with a lot of my points. And this is only just to get a discussion going and to see if what people think. Speaking of Soul Calibur's seem to understanding of events that already transpired, it appears that Soul Calibur calling to Siegfried instead of Siegfried getting Soul Calibur after he defeats Inferno and Soul Calibur 2, at least in his mental state. It would suggest that Soul Calibur is aware that Siegfried once wielded him, whatever you want to say it, the blade. And knowing that Siegfried is powerful enough to use the sword to good potential and be able to defeat Nightmare in various forms, it speaks to it probably understanding that it needs Siegfried to save her. So what this again speaks to is the idea that the swords are aware of previous timelines and they're planning things that didn't happen in other timelines. Again, these the 8, I believe they are, or Mark, you can tell me what they are. I forgot already. That have manifested as beings within the conscious of Soul Edge, did not exist in the previous timeline. They're obviously there to keep Soul Edge from completely losing like it did in the previous timeline. So this speaks to Siegfried being the cornerstone of that story. It kind of hinges on him becoming and staying Nightmare forever, or being able to be separated. At least, again, in my opinion. Well, the last thing what was the last point I wanted to make? The last point I want to make is basically Siegfried's protagonist role in the series Soul Calibur. It's basically something that has become evident in retrospect. I've talked about this with Mark before, and that initially it didn't seem like there was much plan for Siegfried and his story. Obviously, teams change, ideas change, plans change, and the story kind of twists and turns as it does. But it would appear that Mitsurugi was initially the main protagonist. But if you look at the story closer, it's actually Sophitia and Taki who end up defeating Cervantes, and then obviously Siegfried defeating later Cervantes Inferno and becoming Nightmare. But that was only a potential story that could have happened. I think Marcus showed that even Huang could have been tainted by Soul Edge when he came back from his journey. But that's the story they went with. And obviously, in Soul Calibur 1, it's Kilik, Xianghua who are the main protagonists, and everybody else takes a backseat, and Nightmare's the villain. But then you look at Soul Calibur 2, and there's not very clear who the hero is, who's the protagonist. It can be argued maybe Raphael, but he's kind of more just an anti-hero, if you ask me, around that time. But if you look at the story again, backing up, it's basically Siegfried Nightmare who separates himself from Inferno and releases Soul Calibur, which again leads to Soul Calibur 3, which again, at that point, Siegfried's obviously the main protagonist at that point. And now I'm speaking to the new timeline. It would again appear that Siegfried does play a much more key role than perhaps the the marketing is showing, because obviously marketing is just, you know, who do people know? They seem to know Mitsurugi, and they seem to know Geralt, if you look at the cover art. But who's always been the main poster boy, at least from Project Soul onwards, has been Nightmare. And I just think it's an interesting keynote to bring up. Obviously, my views are my own. I kind of speak for myself in a lot of this in this moment. There are legitimate objective facts that are brought up during this discussion, but there's also, again, a lot of speculation, a lot of how do you interpret the lore, how do you interpret the dialogue, how do you interpret character design and character interaction. So feel free to discuss amongst yourselves or hit me up. I don't have any really social media outlets. I'm basically on Discord. I don't have a Twitter. I have an Instagram, but there's nothing on there. And then I have a Facebook, and that's just like family stuff. So feel free to hit me up on Discord. DeathSoul777 is my name. You can at me at whatever you want to at me at. Mark, thank you so much for the opportunity. And hope you guys have a great and wonderful day. Peace.
And thank you.